She smashed my birthday cake into my face, and everyone laughed until an ER doctor stared at my x-ray and quietly called 911. How could a family joke turn into a criminal report in less than 12 hours? My name is Kelly Hughes. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a financial analyst, the kind of person who color codes budgets, plans 5 years ahead, and believes that if you stay responsible enough, life eventually becomes safe. For a long time, I thought independence meant protection. I built my career without help. I saved every spare dollar. I was finally close to buying my own home outright. No cosigner, no favors, no strings. And then my sister tried to erase me on camera in front of our family while they called it a joke. I'm telling you this story because I didn't realize how trapped I was until the moment I tasted blood mixed with vanilla frosting. And if you've ever been the easy one in your family, the one who stays quiet, the one who forgives first, the one who gets blamed because it's convenient, then you might recognize yourself in me. It was my 36th birthday dinner, held at a restaurant my mother loved because it looked expensive in photos. You know the type. Soft lighting, polished glass. The kind of place where everyone smiles too wide and pretends nothing ugly could ever happen there. My mom had insisted we celebrate as a family. She said it like it was a gift, like I should be grateful. Dan, my stepdad, sat to her right, wearing the same cautious expression he always wore around her. Dan wasn't cruel. He was just trained. He had learned that disagreeing with my mother meant days of silence. And in our house, silence wasn't peace. Silence was punishment. Then there was Lindsay, my younger sister, only 18 months younger than me, but treated like the firstborn, the favorite, the center of gravity. Lindsay had a way of filling a room without trying. My mother's eyes always brightened when she spoke, like Lindsay was sunlight and the rest of us were just furniture. I've spent my whole life being the furniture. The dinner started like most of our gatherings. My mom talked, Lindsay performed, and I nodded at the right moments. People asked me polite questions about my job. I answered politely. No one asked what I wanted. No one ever did. Still, I tried. I told myself tonight could be normal, maybe even warm. Then the waiter brought the cake. It was huge, frosted perfectly, candles arranged like a little crown of light. The whole table started singing. My mom leaned in to angle the cake so Lindsay could get the best video. Lindsay had her phone up already, smiling like a director, capturing the perfect scene. "Make a wish, Kelly," my mom said, loud enough for other tables to look over. I leaned forward. I remember thinking just for a second, maybe I'll wish for something small, something safe, like peace. And then Lindsay grabbed the cake with both hands and slammed it into my face. Not a playful push. Not a gentle prank. A hit, a sudden, brutal shove that snapped my head backward. I heard the crack before I understood it. The back of my skull collided with the sharp edge of the table behind me. My neck jolted. My vision flickered. The restaurant lights smeared into streaks. For a second, the sound of singing warped into something distant, like I was underwater. Then warmth spread through my hair. At first, my brain tried to label it as frosting. It made sense, cake, candles, laughter. But the warmth didn't feel sweet. It felt wrong, thick, hot. And when I lifted my hand to the back of my head and pulled it away, my fingers were red. Blood. Blood mixed with vanilla. The world tipped sideways. I slid down in my chair, half falling, half collapsing, while the cake plate clattered and someone gasped. I remember hearing a laugh, my mom's laugh. Bright, automatic. The laugh she used when she needed everyone to believe something wasn't serious. "Oh my God, Lindsay," she said, like it was adorable chaos. "You're ridiculous." Lindsay hovered over me, napkin in hand, her voice syrupy. "Kelly, don't be mad. It was just a joke." I blinked hard, trying to focus through tears and frosting. My scalp throbbed. My stomach rolled. The room spun like it couldn't decide which direction was up. And that's when I saw it. Lindsay's face above me. For one brief second, before she rearranged her features into fake concern, she was smiling. Not embarrassed. Not guilty. Satisfied. It wasn't the smile of someone who made a mistake. It was the smile of someone who hit their target. My Aunt Patricia, my mother's younger sister, was sitting near the corner of the table. She'd been quiet all night, as usual, small in her chair, like she was trying to disappear. But when I looked toward her, her face had gone pale. Her hands were gripping the tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Lindsay, not me. It looked like recognition, like she'd seen this before, but no one said anything. No one stood up and shouted, "Are you okay?" in the way that would have stopped everything. My mother waved it off immediately, like she could wave away consequences too. "Kelly, stop being dramatic," she snapped when I tried to sit up and winced. "It's frosting. You're fine." I tasted metal at the back of my throat. Dan half stood and then sat back down, caught between wanting to help and not wanting to anger my mother. Lindsay patted my shoulder like she was comforting a child. And the rest of the family followed my mother's lead, the way they always did. Because in my family, the truth was never what happened. The truth was whatever made Lindsay look innocent. I didn't go to the hospital that night. I went home, showered carefully, and tried to wash the frosting out of my hair without touching the tender spot on the back of my head. When I leaned forward under the water, dizziness rushed through me so fast I had to grip the wall to stay upright. I told myself it was shock. I told myself I just needed sleep. But in the quiet of my apartment, the pain didn't soften. It pulsed with every heartbeat, radiating from the back of my skull. My vision doubled at the edges. My stomach twisted with nausea. Still, I hesitated. Not because I didn't know something was wrong, but because I'd been trained since childhood to believe my pain didn't earn attention. My biological father left when I was 5. One day he was there, the next he was gone, and my mother turned his absence into a rule. We didn't talk about him. We didn't ask why. We pretended the missing piece of our family didn't exist. 2 years later, Dan arrived. He was quiet and passive, a man who had learned survival through agreement. And I learned the same lesson early. If you stay quiet, you keep the peace. If you speak up, you pay for it. And Lindsay was always protected. My mother funded her dreams, defended her mistakes, praised her loudly, loved her openly. When Lindsay walked into a room, my mother's face lit up. When I walked in, her eyes dimmed just slightly, but enough that I noticed, enough that I always noticed. I stopped questioning it decades ago. Some children are simply loved more. That was the story I told myself so I could keep functioning. Lying in bed that night, with my hair still damp and my scalp burning, my thoughts drifted to my grandmother Eleanor, the only person who ever loved me without comparisons. She died 3 years ago and left me a small wooden box with a note in her careful handwriting. "Only open when you truly need to. You'll know when." I'd never opened it. I assumed it was jewelry, old photos, something sentimental. But that night, staring into the dark, my mind pulled up something I'd tried to forget. Lindsay arguing with Grandma's lawyer at the funeral. Lindsay's face red with anger. Lindsay snapping into sweetness the moment she saw me watching. Then another memory surfaced, sharp and unwanted. The staircase fall 10 days after the funeral. The weeks of chest pain. The way Lindsay insisted I didn't need a doctor. "It's just a bruise," she'd said. "You always overreact." My head throbbed harder. I pressed my palm against the back of my skull, breathing shallowly. And for the first time in my life, I let myself ask a question that terrified me. What if this wasn't a joke? What if it was a pattern? What if I hadn't been clumsy? What if I'd been targeted? The next morning, I couldn't ignore it anymore. My vision was swimming. The pain was relentless. I grabbed my keys, drove to the emergency room with white knuckles, and told myself I was being responsible, just being safe. I didn't know that within hours, a doctor would look at my scans and make a call that would change everything. Because the X-ray wouldn't just show what happened last night. It would expose what had been happening to me for years, right under my family's laughter. And once you see a pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. The emergency room was too bright. That was my first clear thought when I pushed through the sliding glass doors. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh and clinical, like they were designed to expose things people would rather keep hidden. I remember gripping the front desk counter because the floor felt unstable beneath me. My voice sounded far away when I told the triage nurse, "I hit my head last night." She looked up immediately. "When?" "About 12 hours ago." Her eyes sharpened. I saw the shift. Head injuries weren't something they brushed aside. Within minutes, I was in a plastic chair with a blood pressure cuff, squeezing my arm while she asked questions in a calm, steady rhythm. Nausea? Yes. Dizziness? Yes. Blurred vision? Yes. Loss of consciousness? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe, for a second. She typed quickly, her expression neutral but attentive. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, the impact, the spinning room, Lindsay's smile. I told myself again that it had been a stupid joke, an overreaction. I almost laughed at the irony of that word. They moved me back sooner than I expected. A nurse helped me onto a narrow bed and peeled back the bandage I'd pressed against the back of my head. "That's a decent cut," she murmured. "We'll get imaging done." Imaging. The word sounded bigger than it needed to be. The CT scan room was cold, the machine looming above me like a silent witness. I lay still as instructed, staring at the ceiling while the machine whirred around my head. I tried to focus on something neutral: numbers, budgets, the mental math I did every day at work, but the quiet space gave my thoughts too much room to wander. I remembered how Lindsay had insisted on pouring my wine. I remembered how quickly my limbs had felt heavy during dinner. I remembered the strange, floaty sensation even before the cake hit my face. No, I shut the thought down. That was paranoia. That was dramatic. After the scan, they wheeled me back to the exam room. I watched the clock on the wall tick forward in stiff, mechanical jumps, every minute stretched. The headache throbbed in sync with the sound. When Dr. Matthews entered, I knew something was different before he even spoke. He had the kind of presence that felt steady, grounded, gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, careful posture, but his eyes weren't casual anymore. They were focused in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Miss Hughes," he said gently, pulling up a stool beside the bed, "you do have a hairline fracture on your skull from last night's impact." The words felt unreal. "A fracture," I repeated. "Yes, it's small. It should heal with monitoring and rest. We'll give you detailed instructions." I nodded automatically, trying to process it. A fracture. From a birthday cake. "But," he continued, turning the monitor toward me, "that's not what concerns me." My pulse quickened. He clicked to another image. "This is your chest X-ray. We ran it because of some tenderness you mentioned while we were assessing you." I leaned forward slightly. The image looked abstract to me, ribs like pale arcs against shadow. "Here," he said, pointing to a faint, uneven line along one rib. "This indicates a prior fracture. It healed without proper alignment. Based on calcification patterns, I'd estimate this injury occurred approximately 3 years ago." 3 years. The word echoed in my head like a dropped glass shattering. 3 years ago was the staircase fall. 10 days after Grandma's funeral, the night I slipped, or thought I slipped, and tumbled down half a flight of stairs. I remembered how it hurt to breathe for weeks afterward, how even laughing felt like someone driving a nail into my side. I remembered Lindsay bringing me ice packs, making soup, insisting I didn't need to waste money on urgent care. "It's just bruising," she'd said, smiling like she was the voice of reason. I swallowed. I didn't know it was broken. Dr. Matthews studied me carefully. "Did anyone encourage you not to seek medical attention at the time?" My throat tightened. I could hear Lindsay's voice so clearly. "You always overreact. Don't be dramatic. It's nothing." I hesitated too long. He didn't press aggressively. He didn't accuse. But something in his expression shifted, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. "Miss Hughes," he said, choosing his words with care, "I need to explain something to you. When we observe injury patterns that suggest repeated harm or untreated trauma, we are legally obligated to consider the possibility of ongoing abuse." Abuse. The word felt foreign, too heavy to belong in my life. Abuse was something that happened in dark alleys, in homes with shouting and broken furniture, not at birthday dinners with candles and expensive wine. "That's not," I started automatically. "My sister and I were joking around. I fell." He nodded slowly, but his eyes remained steady. Sometimes harm is framed as accidents. Sometimes people minimize their own injuries. But the combination of a current skull fracture, a prior untreated rib fracture, and the circumstances you've described raises concerns. My heart pounded harder. I've already contacted a detective, he added quietly. It doesn't mean anyone is being accused at this moment. It means we ensure your safety. I felt heat rush to my face. You called the police? I did. A swirl of panic rose in my chest. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family? I imagined Lindsay's expression shifting from sweet concern to sharp fury. I imagined my mother positioning herself between me and any outsider, ready to rewrite the narrative. Before I could say anything else, there was a knock at the door. Detective Morrison entered with calm composure. She introduced herself, pulled a chair close to my bed, and spoke in a voice that wasn't confrontational, just steady. I'd like to ask you a few questions about last night and about prior injuries, if that's okay. I nodded, even though my hands were trembling. She asked about the birthday dinner, who suggested the cake ceremony, who poured the drinks, who was standing behind me when I fell. She asked about the staircase incident 3 years ago. Who was nearby? Who advised me not to see a doctor? Every answer led back to Lindsay. It felt wrong saying her name over and over in that context. She was my sister. We had shared bedrooms, holidays, childhood memories. Sisters fought, yes, sisters competed. But sisters didn't plan, did they? I hesitated when Detective Morrison asked about the wine. Did it taste different? She asked gently. I paused. I had brushed off the heaviness, the floaty sensation. I told myself I was tired. I felt disoriented before the cake, I admitted slowly. I thought it was just stress. She made a note. The room felt smaller with each question. Then the curtain burst open. My mother walked in first, her expression tight with barely disguised anger. Dan followed, shoulders hunched. Lindsay came in last, eyes already wet, mascara smudged just enough to look convincingly distressed. Oh my God! Kelly, she cried, rushing forward. I've been so worried. Detective Morrison stood calmly. We're speaking with Miss Hughes. This is a family matter, my mother snapped. My daughter is overreacting. The familiar script unfolded instantly. Kelly is dramatic. Kelly exaggerates. Lindsay didn't mean anything by it. I watched it happen like I was outside my own body. Lindsay reached for my hand, squeezing it lightly. You know I would never hurt you, she whispered. I looked into her eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see innocence. I saw calculation. Detective Morrison didn't argue. She simply observed. We'll need to review security footage from the restaurant, she said calmly. At that, something flickered across Lindsay's face, too quick for anyone else to catch, maybe. But I saw it. Fear. And suddenly, the word abuse didn't feel so impossible anymore. The nurse adjusted my IV while tension filled the room like static before a storm. My mother continued speaking over me, controlling the narrative, but the detective's gaze never left Lindsay. I realized something then that made my skin prickle. If this had truly been a harmless joke, Lindsay wouldn't be afraid of cameras. And if my injuries had truly been accidents, there wouldn't be a pattern. For the first time in 36 years, someone outside my family was looking at the pieces and seeing what I had been trained not to see. The ER doctor hadn't just treated a fracture. He had cracked open a story that had been buried beneath laughter, excuses, and silence. And as I lay there, the fluorescent lights humming above me, I felt something shift inside my chest. Fear? Yes, but also something else. The smallest spark of clarity. Maybe I wasn't dramatic. Maybe I wasn't clumsy. Maybe I had been surviving something I didn't even have a name for. And now, whether my family liked it or not, the truth was starting to surface. The hospital room felt smaller after my mother and Lindsay arrived, like the air itself had taken sides. My mother stood stiffly at the foot of my bed, her arms crossed, her voice cool and controlled as she explained to Detective Morrison that our family simply had a playful dynamic. Lindsay hovered closer to me, mascara streaked just enough to look tragic, her hand lightly resting on the railing of my bed as if she were the devoted sister, caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding. Dan stayed near the doorway, silent as always, his discomfort visible but never strong enough to turn into action. Detective Morrison listened without interrupting. She didn't argue, didn't challenge directly. She just observed. I realized then that silence could be powerful when it wasn't used to suppress someone but to let them reveal themselves. My mother kept repeating that I was sensitive, that I had always been prone to exaggeration. Lindsay added that we'd always roughhoused growing up. She even laughed softly, as if we were reminiscing about harmless childhood pranks. But something had shifted inside me. The words sounded rehearsed, overused, like a script I'd been cast in since I was 5 years old. Kelly is dramatic. Kelly overreacts. Kelly is clumsy. Detective Morrison eventually asked them to step outside so she could continue speaking with me privately. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but she complied. Lindsay hesitated a second longer than necessary, her eyes flicking toward the detective's notepad before she followed. As soon as the door shut, the room exhaled. "You're not in trouble," Detective Morrison said gently. "But I need to ask something difficult. Has your sister ever intentionally harmed you before?" The question made my stomach tighten. Intentionally. The word felt heavier than accident. I started to shake my head automatically. That reflex to protect the family was so deeply ingrained it almost moved without my permission. But then the memories came back. Sharper now. The staircase fall. The strange sensation of being slightly pushed from behind. The way Lindsay had immediately started crying before anyone even asked what happened. The parking lot incident where I tripped after feeling momentarily dizzy. The barbecue where I stumbled right after Lindsay handed me a drink. Not intentionally, I said slowly. At least I never thought so. She studied me carefully. Patterns can be difficult to recognize when they involve people we love. Love. I wasn't sure that word fit anymore. At least not in the way I'd defined it. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock. Aunt Patricia stepped inside hesitantly, closing the door behind her. She looked smaller than usual, but there was something different in her posture, less apology, more resolve. "I need to say something," she said, her voice trembling but steady. Detective Morrison gave her space. Patricia looked at me first, not the detective. "Kelly, your grandmother left you something important. A box. She told me if anything ever felt wrong, you needed to open it." My breath caught. The wooden box. "I thought it was sentimental," I said faintly. Patricia shook her head. Eleanor suspected things. She documented them. She knew no one would believe her without proof. My pulse quickened. "Proof of what?" Patricia swallowed hard. "Of Lindsay." The room felt very still. Detective Morrison's expression didn't change, but I saw the shift in her focus. "Miss Patricia, can you explain?" Patricia clasped her hands tightly. 3 years ago, when Eleanor was in hospice, Lindsay found out about the house transfer. She was furious. I heard her arguing with Eleanor. She demanded the deed be changed. Eleanor refused. After that, I overheard Lindsay on the phone asking about contesting it legally, and she said something that frightened me. "What did she say?" the detective asked quietly. She said, "If there's no legal way, accidents happen." The words hit me like cold water. Suddenly, the staircase fall didn't feel random anymore. The untreated rib fracture didn't feel like a coincidence. My dizziness at dinner didn't feel like stress. My heart pounded harder as realization began stitching the events together in a way I had avoided for years. Detective Morrison nodded slowly. "We'll obtain the restaurant's security footage," she said. "If there was any tampering with food or drink, it will show." Tampering. The word made my skin prickle. Patricia reached for my hand. "You're not crazy," she whispered. "You were never clumsy." Tears burned behind my eyes, not because I was overwhelmed, but because someone had finally said it. Later that afternoon, after my family had been asked to leave, Detective Morrison returned with an update. "We've secured footage from the restaurant," she said. "There's something you need to see." My stomach twisted, but I nodded. At the station, I sat in a small viewing room while the video played on a monitor in front of us. The footage showed the bar area before dinner. Lindsay was visible, smiling, chatting casually with the bartender. Then she glanced around. Her hand slipped into her purse. She dropped something into one of the glasses. My glass. My breath caught painfully in my chest. She stirred it lightly with a straw before picking up both drinks and walking back toward our table. The next clip showed dinner progressing. I could see myself gradually leaning back in my chair, blinking more often, touching my forehead like I had a headache. And then came the cake moment. From this angle, it was clear. There was no playful shove, no slip. Lindsay planted her feet, gripped the cake firmly, and thrust it forward with deliberate force. My head snapped backward. The room spun, and after I fell, the footage caught something my blurred vision had only hinted at. Lindsay bent down as if to check on me, and then she smiled. Not wide, not obvious, but unmistakable. The detective paused the video. "We also executed a warrant for her phone," she said carefully. "There's a file labeled with your initial." My hands trembled as she scrolled through the recovered notes. Dates, observations, mentions of prior incidents, even a section labeled future. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as she read aloud one entry. Phase 2, evaluate escalation if needed. Must appear accidental. My throat closed. "She wasn't trying to kill you," Detective Morrison continued. "The notes indicate the goal was incapacitation, creating a narrative that you're unable to manage your affairs. The house, the inheritance. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. She hadn't wanted me dead. She wanted me legally dependent. And if I had appeared unstable, injured repeatedly, unable to care for myself, a guardian could have been appointed. Likely Lindsay. The realization was almost harder than the fracture. My entire life, I'd believed I was less capable than her, because that's what I'd been told. But now I saw it clearly. My perceived weakness had been cultivated. Not by accident, by design. I sat there staring at the paused frame of Lindsay's faint smile and felt something inside me shift from fear to certainty. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't dramatic. I had been targeted. And for the first time in my life, the narrative my family had written about me was unraveling under real evidence. As we left the station that evening, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. I felt fragile, yes, but also strangely steady. The truth was terrifying, but it was solid. It had shape. It wasn't something that could be laughed away or dismissed as emotional exaggeration. The ER doctor had seen a fracture, but what he really uncovered was a pattern. And patterns don't lie. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I looked at the wooden box on my shelf. For years, I had believed opening it would be unnecessary. Now I understood it might be the key to everything. The story I thought was about a birthday prank had become something far deeper, a reckoning with 36 years of gaslighting, silence, and carefully disguised harm. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was afraid of how long I had lived without it. That night, I didn't turn on the lights right away when I got home. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, still holding my keys, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside. Everything looked the same. My couch, my kitchen table, the stack of unopened mail on the counter, but nothing felt the same. I wasn't walking back into the life I had left that morning. I was walking into the wreckage of a story I had misunderstood for 36 years. My eyes drifted to the top shelf of my closet almost instinctively. The wooden box. It had been sitting there for 3 years, untouched, patient. My grandmother had pressed it into my hands a week before she passed, her fingers thin but steady. "Only open when you truly need to," she'd said softly. "You'll know when." At the time, I thought it was sentimental drama. I thought maybe she was giving me heirloom jewelry or old family photos. Something nostalgic, something safe. Now I understood it might be something else entirely. I pulled the box down carefully and carried it to the kitchen table. The wood was smooth and worn at the edges, the brass latch slightly tarnished. I ran my thumb across the lid for a moment, remembering the way Grandma used to trace patterns on the back of my hand when I was little, telling me stories about strong women who survived impossible things. "Trust your instincts," she used to say, "even if everyone else tries to convince you they're wrong." I had stopped trusting mine a long time ago. I opened the latch. Inside were 3 items, arranged neatly, deliberately. The first was a thick legal document with an official seal and notarized signatures. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling just enough to make the paper rustle loudly in the quiet room. Transfer on death deed. I read it once, then again, and then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. My grandmother's Victorian house, the one filled with the smell of cinnamon and old books, the one where I had felt safest as a child, had been legally transferred to me. The transfer had taken effect automatically upon her death. No probate, no family vote, no debate. For 3 years, I had legally owned that house, and no one had told me. My throat tightened. I tried to remember if I had ever received paperwork, a letter, a notice, something. Maybe I had. Maybe it had arrived during the fog of grief and work deadlines, and I'd set it aside thinking I'd deal with it later. That sounded like something I would handle everything on my own, quietly, efficiently. But Lindsay wouldn't have set it aside. Lindsay would have read every line. I reached for the second item, an old photograph. Grandma stood in the center, younger, stronger, holding a small child tightly against her chest. Me. I recognized the curls, the uncertain expression I always had in childhood photos, like I wasn't sure whether I was allowed to fully smile. And behind us, slightly out of focus, stood Lindsay. She couldn't have been more than 2, but the expression on her face made my breath catch. It wasn't childish jealousy. It wasn't confusion. It was something darker, focused, controlled. I felt a chill slide down my spine. The third item was a letter in my grandmother's handwriting. I unfolded it slowly, bracing myself without knowing for what. My sweet Kelly, if you are reading this, then something has finally forced you to see what I've known for many years. I tried to protect you in ways your mother would never understand. The words blurred for a moment before I forced myself to continue. I have watched your mother excuse Lindsay's behavior since she was small. I have watched you be blamed for things that were never your fault. I tried to speak, but I was dismissed as dramatic and meddling, so I began to document instead. Your sister discovered the deed transfer while I was in hospice. She was furious. She demanded I change it. I refused. She said there had to be a way to prove I wasn't competent or that you manipulated me. And then she said something that chilled me. She said accidents happen. I pressed my hand against my mouth. Accidents happen. The staircase, the parking lot, the barbecue, the cake. It wasn't random. It had never been random. Grandma's letter continued. The house is yours, legally and permanently. I made sure of it. But you must be careful. I believe Lindsay will not let this go easily. I pray I am wrong. I hope I am wrong. But if you are reading this, then I was not. I always saw you, Kelly, even when no one else did. You are not weak. You are not dramatic. You are not the problem. I set the letter down slowly, my chest aching in a way that had nothing to do with fractures. All these years, I had believed I was the fragile one, the overly sensitive one, the daughter who needed to toughen up. But what if I had simply been surviving? My phone buzzed on the table, making me jump. It was Detective Morrison. We've gone through more of the phone data, she said when I answered. There are detailed notes about the property, timelines, escalation strategies. Escalation strategies. She wasn't planning a single event, the detective continued. She was building a narrative, repeated minor injuries, questionable stability, that could justify a guardianship petition. I closed my eyes. She didn't want you gone, Detective Morrison added carefully. She wanted you legally incapable. My stomach turned. Lindsay didn't want to kill me. She wanted to own me, own my decisions, own my finances, own my grandmother's house, own the narrative. I looked down at the deed on the table, the paper that had quietly protected me for 3 years without my knowledge. Grandma had anticipated this. She had taken legal steps to safeguard me in a way my own mother never had. For the first time, I felt something stronger than fear. Anger. Not loud, explosive anger, but clear, steady anger. I thought about every time I had apologized for being too much. Every time I had accepted being called clumsy. Every time I had minimized my own pain because it made everyone else more comfortable. I had been conditioned to doubt myself so completely that even a skull fracture felt like an overreaction. I picked up the photograph again and studied Lindsay's toddler expression. Had the signs been there all along? Or had I simply been trained not to look? The house, the deed, the documented threats, the footage of her slipping something into my drink. The pattern was undeniable now. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to ask a different question. Not, what did I do wrong? But why was I taught to believe I had? The wooden box sat open in front of me like a quiet witness. My grandmother had known she couldn't fix my mother. She couldn't change Lindsay. But she could give me proof. She could give me protection. She had left me more than a house. She had left me clarity. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights flickering in the distance. Somewhere, Lindsay was likely scrambling, calling lawyers, rewriting her own version of events. My mother was probably convincing herself this was still some kind of misunderstanding. But the truth had weight now. It had documentation. And documentation doesn't care about denial. I turned back toward the table and gathered the papers carefully. Tomorrow, I would meet with an estate attorney to confirm everything. Tomorrow, I would hand over copies to Detective Morrison. Tomorrow, I would stop protecting the narrative that had harmed me. But tonight, I allowed myself one quiet realization. For 36 years, I had been trying to prove I wasn't the problem. I didn't need to prove it anymore. The evidence was doing that for me. And as I closed the wooden box gently, I understood something that felt both terrifying and freeing. The story of my life was no longer being written by my family. It was being written by truth. The next morning, I didn't wake up feeling rested. I woke up feeling awake in a way I had never been before. There's a difference. Rest is physical. Awareness is something else entirely. It's heavier, sharper. It doesn't let you roll over and pretend the world is still what it was yesterday. The wooden box was still on my kitchen table where I had left it. The deed, the photograph, my grandmother's letter. Proof that the story I'd been living inside was incomplete at best and deliberately manipulated at worst. I made coffee and sat down with my laptop, hands steady despite the storm in my chest. I contacted an estate attorney whose name I found through a colleague. I kept the message simple and factual. I recently discovered a transfer on death deed for a property belonging to my late grandmother. I need confirmation of its current legal standing. Within hours, I was sitting across from him in a small, neutral office that smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. He reviewed the document carefully, adjusting his glasses as he read through each clause. "This is solid," he said finally. "It transferred automatically upon her death. If no one contested it within the legal window, it's yours, completely. Is there any way it could be reversed now?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "Highly unlikely, especially after 3 years. It would require extraordinary proof of fraud or incompetence, and that's extremely difficult to establish retroactively." Extraordinary proof. The words echoed in my mind. Lindsay had been looking for exactly that. When I left the office, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt validated. The house was mine not because I manipulated anyone, not because I schemed, but because my grandmother made a deliberate legal choice. And Lindsay had known. I drove straight to the police station after that. Detective Morrison met me in a conference room with a folder already prepared. I handed her copies of the deed and my grandmother's letter. She read them carefully, especially the line about Lindsay saying, "Accidents happen." "This strengthens motive," she said calmly. "Financial motive, control motive." I nodded. She wasn't trying to kill me. "No," Morrison agreed. "The notes we recovered suggest incapacitation, not fatal harm." She slid a printed document across the table. It was a reconstructed file from Lindsay's phone, deleted notes recovered through forensic analysis. The file title was simple, K. Underneath were dates. Observations. Stairs success, but incomplete. Parking lot no hospital visit. Birthday phase 1. My throat tightened. At the bottom of the page was a section labeled Future. Phase 2. Escalate if needed. Must appear accidental. Document instability. My hands trembled slightly as I traced the words with my eyes. She was building a pattern, Detective Morrison said. If you appeared repeatedly injured, disoriented, or medically unstable, it could support a guardianship petition. Combined with financial pressure or concern from a close relative like your mother, it becomes easier. My mother. The thought landed heavily. Had my mother known? Had she suspected? Or had she simply chosen blindness because it was easier than confronting the truth? We'll need to speak with your mother formally, Morrison continued. As a potential witness, I let out a slow breath. I want to be there. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. That's your right. The meeting took place 2 days later in a small, sterile room that felt nothing like our family dining table and yet somehow more honest. My mother arrived looking composed, her posture rigid as if she believed poise could shield her from reality. Dan followed quietly. Lindsay was not present. She had already retained legal counsel. The prosecutor laid out the evidence methodically. The restaurant footage, the phone records, the notes, the prior untreated injury, the deed. At first, my mother responded exactly as I expected. This is ridiculous, she said. Kelly has always been sensitive. Lindsay was just being playful. This is being blown out of proportion. But the prosecutor didn't argue emotionally. She presented facts, one after another, calmly, irrefutably. I watched my mother's expression shift in increments so small, most people wouldn't notice. The denial thinning, the certainty cracking. When the prosecutor mentioned prior incidents involving Lindsay in childhood, documented school transfers, neighbor complaints, my mother's composure faltered. I handled those, she said quickly. Children go through phases. And did you ever seek professional evaluation? The prosecutor asked gently. Silence. My mother's hands began to tremble. I knew something was different, she whispered finally. But I thought, if I loved her enough, she trailed off. The room was very quiet. And Kelly? The prosecutor asked. Did you notice any pattern of harm toward her? My mother's eyes flicked toward me for a split second before dropping to the table. She was strong, she said weakly. Independent. She didn't need as much attention. That was the lie she had told herself for years. It sounded thinner in a room full of evidence. As the meeting ended, I felt something unexpected, not anger, not satisfaction. Clarity. My mother had not orchestrated what happened to me, but she had allowed it. Through denial, through favoritism, through refusal to see. When we stepped outside, she reached for my arm. Kelly, this is getting out of control, she whispered urgently. You don't understand what this will do to our family. I looked at her, really looked at her. Our family? I asked softly. What about what it's done to me? She didn't have an answer. A week later, Detective Morrison called to tell me they were ready to proceed with arrest. We'd like to execute it at a predictable location, she said. Minimize risk, ensure accountability. Sunday dinner, I replied immediately. There was a pause. Are you certain? Yes. If this had unfolded in front of witnesses, if my humiliation had been public, then the truth deserved to be public too. Sunday arrived heavy with tension. My mother had insisted dinner would be normal. Lindsay arrived composed, smiling faintly, acting as though everything was an unfortunate misunderstanding soon to be cleared up. She looked at me across the table with something almost like pity. You look tired, she said softly. Stress doesn't suit you. For years, that tone would have unraveled me. Now it only confirmed what I already knew. Halfway through dinner, the doorbell rang. 2 uniformed officers entered with Detective Morrison. The shift in Lindsay's face was subtle but unmistakable. Confusion first, then calculation, then fear. She stood slowly as the charges were read aloud: assault with premeditation, poisoning, criminal harassment. This is insane, she said, her voice trembling in what might have been genuine disbelief or simply a performance. When the handcuffs clicked into place, something inside her cracked. This is your fault, she snapped at me, the sweetness evaporating. You've always been jealous. You can't stand that people love me more. The room was silent. There it was, the narrative she'd relied on my entire life, but it didn't hold power anymore. As she was led toward the door, She turned back one last time. That house should have been mine, she hissed. And in that moment, any lingering doubt I had dissolved completely. It had never been about sisterhood. It had been about possession. After they left, no one spoke for a long time. My mother stared at the table like she was seeing it for the first time. Dan remained silent, as always. I stood up slowly. "I'm done being the quiet one," I said simply. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, because for the first time, the truth wasn't something I had to defend. It was something documented, undeniable, and finally out in the open. And as I walked out of that house, I realized something that felt almost like freedom. The narrative of Kelly the Dramatic was over. The evidence had rewritten it, and I was no longer afraid of what came next. After Lindsay's arrest, the silence that followed was louder than any argument we'd ever had. It wasn't just the absence of her voice, it was the absence of the illusion she'd carefully maintained for decades. For the first time in my life, there was no performance to respond to, no emotional script to follow, just facts, just consequences, and the uncomfortable weight of truth settling over everyone who had once chosen not to see it. The investigation didn't stop with her arrest. In many ways, that was just the beginning. Over the next week, Detective Morrison walked me through the broader timeline they had reconstructed from Lindsay's phone records, deleted files, pharmacy logs, and digital searches. Sitting across from her in the station felt surreal, like I was listening to a case study instead of my own life. "The staircase incident happened 10 days after your grandmother's funeral," she began, sliding a printed timeline toward me. "The same week, the property transfer paperwork was finalized." I nodded slowly. I remembered that week clearly. Grief blurred everything. I was barely sleeping. I'd received a letter from an estate office, but told myself I'd deal with it later. I had deadlines at work, meetings, responsibilities. I always had responsibilities. Lindsay had acted immediately. She searched contest transfer on death deed multiple times that week, Morrison continued. She also looked up signs of mental incompetence in elderly and how to challenge property inheritance. The words felt cold and clinical, strategic, not emotional, not impulsive. "Then the staircase fall," the detective said. "Based on messages we recovered, she documented it as initial attempt, successful but insufficient." I felt my stomach drop. Attempt, not accident. "The parking lot incident occurred the same week you told your mother you might visit the house," she added. "And the barbecue fall was shortly after you mentioned renovations." Every injury lined up with proximity to the property. It wasn't clumsiness. It was interference. The sedative used at the restaurant turned out to be a prescription anti-anxiety medication. Not something lethal, not something dramatic, but enough to cause dizziness and disorientation, especially when mixed with alcohol. She'd been doctor shopping, Morrison explained, visiting multiple clinics over months. Small prescriptions, harder to trace individually, but together it forms a pattern. A pattern. I used to think patterns were for spreadsheets and financial reports. Now I understood they were also for survival. "She wasn't planning to kill you," Morrison repeated gently. "Her notes indicate she wanted escalation only if necessary. The ultimate goal was guardianship. If you appeared unstable enough, multiple accidents, documented disorientation, hospital visits, she could argue you weren't capable of managing your affairs." Managing my affairs, my life, my home, my autonomy. The cruelty wasn't explosive. It was methodical, and that somehow felt worse. A few days later, the prosecutor requested another meeting with my mother. This time, it wasn't just about evidence. It was about understanding the family dynamic that had allowed this to unfold for so long. I agreed to attend again. My mother looked older when she walked into the room this time, not dramatically, but subtly, the kind of aging that comes from realizing you've been wrong for too long. The prosecutor asked about Lindsay's childhood, behavioral incidents, complaints from neighbors, school transfers. At first, my mother tried to soften everything. "Children experiment with boundaries," she said weakly. "They grow out of phases." But when confronted with documented complaints, a neighbor's pet disappearance, a classmate's unexplained injury, her voice faltered. "I moved her schools," she admitted quietly. I convinced parents not to report. I thought if I protected her enough, she'd stabilize. And Kelly? The prosecutor asked. My mother hesitated. Kelly was independent. She didn't demand attention. The sentence landed like a quiet confession. I wasn't independent. I had been neglected. There's a difference. Later that evening, after the meeting ended, my mother asked if she could speak to me alone. We stood in the hallway outside the building, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I never meant for you to be hurt, she said, her voice fragile in a way I'd never heard before. I was hurt, I replied calmly. For years. She looked down at her hands. I thought you were strong enough. I shouldn't have had to be. The simplicity of that truth hung between us. For the first time, she didn't argue. The legal process moved forward steadily after that. Lindsay's attorney attempted to frame the events as misunderstandings, sibling rivalry exaggerated by stress. But the combination of digital evidence, surveillance footage, pharmacy records, and documented injuries formed something solid, something undeniable. I attended the preliminary hearing quietly, sitting in the second row. Lindsay looked smaller, without her usual stage. No dramatic tears, no exaggerated gestures. Just a woman confronted with documentation she couldn't charm her way around. At one point, she glanced back at me, not with anger, not with apology, with calculation. Even then, even now, the court ordered mandatory psychiatric evaluation as part of the proceedings. That wasn't about punishment, it was about assessment. And the report that followed described patterns of manipulation, lack of remorse, and strategic harm for personal gain. Reading those words was both validating and devastating. I didn't want a clinical label for my sister. I wanted a normal one. But normal had never really been part of our story. After one particularly long day of legal meetings, I drove to my grandmother's house for the first time since the arrest. The Victorian structure stood quietly at the end of the street, paint slightly faded but sturdy. I unlocked the door slowly and stepped inside. Dust floated in the sunlight streaming through the windows. The air smelled like old wood and something faintly sweet like cinnamon lingering from years ago. I walked through each room carefully. The kitchen where she used to bake. The living room where she read to me when my mother was too busy. The staircase where she once told me, "You deserve to take up space." I sat down in the front room and let myself breathe. For so long, I had believed survival meant shrinking, not demanding too much, not challenging the narrative, not making waves. But survival, I was beginning to understand, sometimes meant the opposite. It meant speaking. It meant documenting. It meant refusing to protect the lie any longer. I ran my hand along the wall, imagining turning this house into something alive again. Not just a property, not just an inheritance. Something purposeful. The thought wasn't fully formed yet. Just a quiet possibility. Later that night, Detective Morrison called with an update. The formal charges are moving forward, she said. Given the documented premeditation, this won't be treated lightly. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in the dim light of my grandmother's living room and allowed myself to feel something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, resolve. Because this wasn't just about proving Lindsay guilty. It was about reclaiming the narrative that had shaped my entire life. For years, I believed I was the unstable one, the clumsy one, the dramatic one. Now, piece by piece, the evidence was reconstructing the truth. And the truth didn't need embellishment. It didn't need performance. It simply existed. As I locked the house and stepped back into the cool night air, I realized something quietly powerful. For the first time, my future wasn't being written in reaction to someone else's manipulation. It was being written by choice. And that choice to stand in the light instead of shrinking in the shadow felt like the beginning of something entirely new. A few weeks after Lindsay's arrest, just when I thought there couldn't possibly be another layer to uncover, Aunt Patricia called and asked if she could come by. Her voice on the phone sounded different, quieter than usual, but steadier. There was something resolved in it, like a decision had finally matured. When she arrived at my apartment that evening, she didn't sit down right away. She stood near the window, hands clasped together, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the glass. "There's something I never told you," she said. My chest tightened. I had learned to brace myself when people said that. "It's about when you were little. she continued. 6 years old. The air felt thinner. You and Lindsay were playing upstairs at your mother's house. It was Thanksgiving. I went up to call you both for dinner. Her voice began to tremble, but she didn't stop. I saw Lindsay standing behind you at the top of the basement stairs. She looked around first, like she was checking if anyone was watching. My stomach dropped before she even finished the sentence. She put both hands on your back and pushed. For a moment, the world tilted, not physically, like the night of the cake, but emotionally, like the floor of my childhood had cracked open beneath me. The memory rushed back in fragments. The sudden sensation of falling, the cold shock of concrete, the sharp pain in my arm, the cast that followed, the way my mother had sighed and said, "Kelly, you have to be more careful." "I told your mother what I saw," Patricia said softly, tears gathering in her eyes. "She told me I was imagining things. She said I was jealous. She threatened to cut me off from the family if I ever repeated that accusation." I closed my eyes. 30 years of carrying a false narrative. "She was already crying when the adults got there," Patricia whispered. "She said, 'You tripped,' that she tried to catch you." Of course she did. Lindsay had always cried first, controlled the story first. I felt an ache rise in my chest, not just for the injury, but for the child I had been. A child who had internalized the label clumsy because it was easier than questioning why she kept falling. "I'm sorry," Patricia said, her voice breaking. "I was afraid of my sister. I stayed quiet. I convinced myself it wasn't my place." I reached for her hand. "You were surviving too," I said quietly, because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Our family system had trained everyone in it. Some to dominate, some to protect, some to disappear. Patricia wiped her eyes and sat down finally. "There's more," she said hesitantly. "Something your grandmother never got to tell you." That night, after she left, I drove back to Grandma's house. I don't know what compelled me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was grief resurfacing in a different shape. Maybe it was the sense that if there were more truths buried, they were waiting there. The house felt different this time, less like a relic, more like a witness. While cleaning out an old writing desk, I noticed something unusual about the back panel. It shifted slightly when I pressed against it. Behind it was a shallow, hidden compartment. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax. It was addressed to my mother. Stamped across the front were the words, "Return to sender, refused." My hands trembled as I broke the seal carefully. The letter was dated 31 years ago, and the first line stole the air from my lungs. "I need to tell you what really happened the day Michael left, and why he was running from Lindsay, not Kelly. Michael, my father." I read the letter slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. According to my grandmother, when I was 6 months old, my father came home early and found Lindsay, barely 2 years old, standing inside my crib with a pillow pressed against my face. I stopped breathing for a moment. He pulled her away just in time. He begged my mother to get Lindsay evaluated. She refused. For 4 years, my father tried to convince her something was wrong. He watched. He worried. He pleaded. Finally, when I was 5, he left. Not because of me, because he believed he couldn't protect me. The narrative that had shaped my entire identity, Kelly the difficult baby, Kelly the reason Dad left, crumbled in seconds. I sat down heavily in my grandmother's old chair, letters shaking in my hands. All these years, my mother had looked at me with subtle resentment, as if my existence had broken something. But I hadn't broken anything. I had survived something. I drove straight to my mother's house that night. She opened the door, startled to see me so late. Without speaking, I handed her the letter. She read it slowly. I watched her face move through stages: confusion, denial, recognition, devastation. "I remember this," she whispered finally. "I remember refusing it." She sank into a chair like her legs could no longer hold her. "I blamed you," she said hoarsely, "for everything. Because it was easier than admitting." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Admitting what?" I asked quietly. "That I failed both of you." The room felt painfully honest in a way it never had before. "You chose the lie," I said gently but firmly. And I paid for it. Tears streamed down her face. What can I do? She asked. I thought about that for a long time. Forgiveness wasn't a light switch. Trust wasn't automatic. You need therapy, I said finally. Alone, not to fix me, not to fix Lindsay. To understand why you ignored what was in front of you. She nodded slowly. And don't contact me until you've done the work, I added. I decide what happens next. Walking out of that house felt different than any other time I'd left it. For once, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't explaining myself. I was setting a boundary. In the weeks that followed, the court proceedings continued. Lindsay's psychiatric evaluation confirmed patterns of manipulation and calculated harm. It wasn't explosive rage. It was controlled, strategic behavior aimed at control. Hearing it described clinically was surreal, but it also gave shape to something I had felt since childhood. The court imposed strict conditions, long-term protective orders, mandatory treatment, monitoring, consequences that were measured, legal, structured. Justice, in real life, isn't cinematic. It's procedural, but it matters. After everything, I returned once more to my grandmother's house. I stood in the front room and looked around, imagining what it could become. Not a monument to trauma. Not a reminder of what almost happened. Something better. A space for people who had been silenced. A place where stories weren't dismissed as dramatic. The idea formed slowly but firmly. And as I stood there, sunlight filtering through old windows, I realized something profound. The greatest damage Lindsay caused wasn't the physical injuries. It was the erosion of my self-trust. And the greatest victory wasn't her arrest. It was rebuilding that trust, piece by piece. I wasn't the clumsy child. I wasn't the dramatic daughter. I wasn't the reason my father left. I was the one who survived long enough to uncover the truth. And that truth, no matter how painful, set me free in a way silence never could. 2 months after Lindsay's arrest, the case reached its conclusion. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown like in the movies. No shouting, no last-minute confessions. Real life is quieter than that. It moves through paperwork, evaluations, testimonies, and long stretches of waiting where you sit with your own thoughts more than anything else. Lindsay's defense tried to frame everything as a misunderstanding sibling rivalry exaggerated by stress, a few poor decisions taken out of context. But the evidence didn't bend. The surveillance footage, the recovered notes labeled with my initial, the search history, the pharmacy trail, the documented pattern of injuries, it formed a story too cohesive to dismiss. In the end, the judge delivered a sentence that reflected both the severity of the premeditation and the absence of permanent physical injury. Lindsay received a structured probation term, months of home confinement with electronic monitoring, mandatory psychiatric treatment, restitution for my medical expenses, and a long-term restraining order that legally prevented her from contacting me or coming near me or my grandmother's house. It wasn't vengeance. It was accountability, and that mattered. When the hearing ended, Lindsay didn't look at me. Not once. She kept her eyes fixed forward, jaw tight, expression controlled. I couldn't tell whether she felt anger, humiliation, or simply frustration that her plan hadn't worked. Maybe all three. As I stepped outside the courthouse, I expected to feel triumph. Instead, I felt light, not because my sister was facing consequences, but because the weight of doubt I had carried for decades was gone. For the first time in my life, I wasn't questioning my own memory. I wasn't replaying events wondering if I'd exaggerated them. I wasn't shrinking to make someone else comfortable. I drove straight to my grandmother's house that afternoon. The Victorians stood quietly in the sunlight, paint newly refreshed, windows cleaned, the porch repaired. Renovations had been slow and deliberate over the past months, not just cosmetic changes, but structural reinforcements. I had poured time and savings into restoring it, piece by piece, the way I was restoring myself. Standing in the front room, I looked around at the fresh walls, the polished floors, the open space. The idea that had begun as a fragile thought weeks earlier had grown into something solid. I wasn't going to keep this house as a private sanctuary. I was going to open it. 14 months after my birthday, the one that began with cake and blood and laughter that wasn't laughter, I stood in that same front room beneath a small, newly mounted sign outside. Patricia's house. Named after my aunt, who had finally found the courage to speak the truth she'd held inside for 30 years. It wasn't a grand institution. It wasn't flashy. But it was intentional. A small resource center for survivors of family abuse. A place where women and sometimes men could sit at a kitchen table without being told they were overreacting. A place where documentation, legal referrals, and emotional validation existed side by side. Patricia volunteered twice a week. Therapy had changed her posture. She stood taller now. She made eye contact. She spoke without apologizing for her voice. Watching her help other women name what they had experienced became one of the quietest, strongest forms of healing I've ever witnessed. Sometimes I'd sit in the hallway and listen to conversations drift through the house, soft voices admitting truths they'd never said out loud before. And every time, I thought about the girl I had been. The girl who fell down the stairs and believed it was her own fault. The girl who hit her head on a table and wondered if she was being dramatic. This house was for her, too. 16 months after that birthday, a car pulled up outside the center. I recognized it immediately. My mother stepped out slowly, holding a cardboard box against her chest. She had been in therapy for over a year by then. We hadn't spoken much beyond logistical matters. Boundaries aren't dramatic. They're quiet and firm. When she rang the doorbell, I opened it, but didn't step aside. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," she said softly. Her voice was different now, less sharp, less certain. My therapist helped me understand that forgiveness is your choice, not something I'm entitled to. She held out the box. "I found more of your grandmother's things, journals, photo albums. I thought they belonged here." I took the box carefully. We stood there in a silence that felt honest instead of oppressive. "I'm continuing therapy," she added, "even if we never rebuild what we had." "That's the right reason," I replied. We didn't hug. We didn't pretend everything was repaired. Some damage doesn't disappear, but accountability had begun, and that was something. After she left, I carried the box inside and set it on the long wooden table in the front room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust particles in the air like tiny suspended moments. Women were moving quietly through the hallway, one speaking with Patricia, another filling out paperwork, someone else just sitting in a chair and breathing. I realized something then. Revenge had never truly interested me. What I wanted was recognition, truth, safety. And now, standing in a house that once held my grandmother's quiet protection and now held open doors for others, I understood something deeper. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's construction. It's building something so rooted in truth that manipulation can't touch it. For 36 years, I believed I was the problem. The clumsy one. The dramatic one. The daughter who made her father leave. The sister who couldn't measure up. But none of those narratives were mine. They were projections. Excuses. Cover stories for someone else's harm. The moment I stopped accepting them was the moment my life shifted direction. People often ask me now if I hate my sister. The honest answer is complicated. I don't wake up thinking about her anymore. That's the freedom. I think about budgets for the center, about repainting the upstairs office, about grant applications, about the woman who came in last week and whispered, "I thought it was my fault." I told her what my grandmother once told me. Trust your instincts, because instinct, when it's not drowned out by years of gaslighting, is powerful. The cake, the fracture, the X-ray, those were catalysts, but the real transformation wasn't legal. It was internal. It was the moment I decided I would no longer participate in my own erasure. And if you've listened this far, if you've recognized even a piece of yourself in my story, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not dramatic for wanting safety. You are not weak for needing boundaries. You are not selfish for choosing yourself. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us fail. Sometimes they enable harm because facing it feels too frightening. But silence is not strength, and shrinking is not peace. Standing in the doorway of Patricia's house at the end of each day, locking up after the last visitor leaves, I often pause and look back at the quiet rooms. This house once held secrets. Now it holds voices, and that is the legacy my grandmother left me. Not just property, not just protection, but proof that truth, once uncovered, can become something stronger than fear. I didn't get revenge. I got my life back, and that has been more than enough. This story was never just about a cake, or even about a crime. It was about something far more subtle and far more common, the slow erosion of self-trust inside a family where truth is inconvenient. What makes this story powerful isn't only the investigation, the evidence, or the courtroom outcome. It's the emotional journey from doubt to clarity, from maybe I'm overreacting to I was never the problem. That shift is something many people quietly long for but rarely witness so clearly. At its heart, this video is about patterns, how harm can hide behind laughter, how manipulation can wear the mask of love, and how silence can become complicity. But it's also about rebuilding, about turning pain into purpose, about reclaiming your voice after years of being told it doesn't matter. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or blamed for something that wasn't yours to carry, know that you're not alone. Subscribe to Henjiwie Iyagi for more deeply human stories like this. Stories about truth, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself. Your voice matters. And sometimes, hearing one story can help you begin rewriting your own.